Well, hello. It's nice to be here with you all. I'm just looking at the faces in the boxes on the screen as we arrive together. Hello, Vanessa.
Hi, Dougald.
It's very nice to be here with you.
Likewise.
I've been talking with the Homeward Bound group last night and this morning about three people whose influence has been formative for me, and you are one of them, along with Alistair McIntosh and Gustavo Esteva. And I know that Gustavo has been part of, or is going to be part of this series with you all as well. So you're in very good company this week. And it was 3 years ago this month that you and I first met, Vanessa. I was realizing at the Climate Existence Conference in Sigtuna, here in Sweden, not very far away from where I'm sitting tonight. And you were talking there about existence beyond the house that modernity built. And it was the first time I'd met this map that you and others from the Gesturing Towards Decolonial Futures Collective have made together. This map of the house that modernity built, the foundations we take for granted, the walls we feel defended by, the roof we feel sheltered by, and then mapping the dawning realization that maybe the house is on fire or falling down or about to be swallowed by a flood. And the different ways that this structure relates depending on where we stand in our historical and ongoing relations. One of the things that I found very helpful in our conversations is this map that you have where you talk about high intensity struggles and low intensity struggles. Not least how difficult it can be when we try to enter into conversation about these kinds of things when some of us in the room are coming from places of low intensity struggles and some of us are coming from places of high intensity struggles. So maybe it would be good to start with you just unfolding that a little for us all.
Okay. So maybe the best way to start that conversation is to acknowledge that that where I come from. So it's and if people, I think, don't understand where I'm speaking from, it's difficult to talk about it. So I'm a product of the colonial encounter. So my dad, who has German ancestry, and moved to Brazil. His family moved to Brazil after the First World War, and then during the Second World War, the family was persecuted in Brazil for being German. So he was born in 46. And he grew up seeing his brothers engaged in agrarian expansion in Brazil. So they would go out in the field, and they were encouraged actually to kill indigenous people, and there was no justice for indigenous people in that sense. So this was the 60s in Brazil. There was a period, especially in one of the states, where his brothers were engaged with that, and they would come home with stories about how they would leave blankets with chicken pox and for trade with indigenous people who didn't have any defenses for the disease, and then as they cleared the land of indigenous people, they become owners of the land that they have cleared. So or take possession of that land. And my dad was really upset about that and angry with his family. So he decided to marry an indigenous person in order to kind of protect this person from the state-sanctioned violence, but also with the idea that in his Germanness, he would also help future generations become white. So I probably wouldn't have been born if the colonial encounter or the colonial conflict was not happening. So, and I, as I was born out of this, I could see the dynamics of cultures in dissonance, right? So I had a grandmother who would say that the house that the white man built is not going to last because it's built on violence. Or it's predicated on violence and unsustainability. And she would tell my mom that it's like buying a ticket to the Titanic, to accept being carried up this ladder. But my mom wanted it. My mom was born in the streets, so she associates indigeneity, just used to associate indigeneity with dispossession. And she wanted enfranchisement. And I could see the dynamics and the paradoxes and the complexities, both on my father's side of wanting to change the world while still being racist, and of my mom wanting to escape the poverty and the dispossession, the destitution that was associated with indigeneity. And growing up in this was very hard, because it's a space where love is mixed with pain, but in trauma, historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, but also a lot of violence going on. And I think my whole educational practice is based on this experience of the complexities and the paradoxes of trying to keep this family together. And they're still together. We're still there. But one important thing I think that came out of these observations is this distinction between cultures that are high intensity, high stakes, where people have their livelihoods already at risk just by the fact of their existence, which could be seen as the struggles of indigenous people in the Amazon right now, fighting to protect the forest against oil companies, mining companies, loggers, and the state, and Bolsonaro, who really wants to destroy indigenous people and environmental rights. And those of us in low intensity struggle, and I'm putting myself in there too, although I work with a lot of people in high intensity struggle, those in low intensity struggle for whom it's a choice. We still have the choice. We don't have the police at our doorstep, or have to deal with questions of hunger or a flood. So in the morning, for example, I received the texts from 2 communities in Brazil, where one community, a Funio indigenous community, where right now there's a drought, and because of the pandemic, there's no other way of income generation. So they were asking for support. Another text from the communities in the Amazon that are suffering a flood. This is the kind of thing where you don't have a choice. It's not a choice. You need to engage in struggle. Otherwise, you or your family or your community is going to die. So it's very important to make the distinction of those who have the choice and those who don't have the choice. Otherwise, we lose perspective of our positions of privilege, but also of what's at stake for different people. And we confuse, sometimes we forget how we are also complicit in what's creating the problems for others, right? So we tend to see ourselves then as just part of the solution rather than also part of the problem. And I'm not saying this to activate any guilt or shame or worthlessness. This is also another trap, another part of the problem, but to put on the table the realness of the situation, that vulnerabilities are unevenly distributed, and the risks are unevenly distributed, and the choices are very different for different communities. I think that's a good start.
Yeah. There's a moment in your book, which is coming out soon. It's not out yet, but it's a book called Hospicing Modernity. And that title in itself might be something worth coming back to. But there's a moment in it that I was thinking of as you were speaking. When you ask us, you say, firstly, you know, if you have the time and the resources to be reading this book, then I'm pretty sure you're in a situation of low intensity struggle. If I were talking about these things with a group of people in a high intensity struggle situation, I'd be talking in a different way and I wouldn't be putting it in a book. So then you turn to those of us who are reading and say, you know, imagine yourself in a room full of people who are in that high intensity struggle where your life is on the line day to day. And imagine how you look and sound to the other people in that room. And just experience the sense that you might look pathetic and ridiculous. And you ask us to stay with that and notice that one of the things that we've been equipped with by this kind of modern colonial culture we're coming out of is a deep sense of shame or panic or distress at feeling pathetic or ridiculous. Mm-hmm. And that maybe actually being able to stay for a while with that feeling of our own uselessness, ridiculousness, you know, that might be helpful. Like that might be maybe one of the preconditions. I guess that's what I wanted to ask you with this question that we've been invited to speak together around. Can we transform our relations given our history? Is like, what might be the conditions of possibility to have a chance, not a guarantee, of the kind of transformation that we're gesturing towards in a conversation like this?
I think with my collective, I think we have come to see the problems we're facing not as a problem of lack of information, but of a denial of four important things: the denial of complicity, the denial of unsustainability, the fact that the planet cannot sustain this, but also the denial of complicity is the fact that our pleasures, our comforts, our securities are subsidized by violence somewhere else. The unsustainability is the fact that the planet cannot sustain exponential growth and consumption indefinitely. Then there's the denial of entanglement, our sense of separation from one another and from the land, and the idea that we're part of this metabolism, this wider metabolism that is the planet and beyond. And the last one is the denial of the magnitude of the challenges and our focus on simplistic solutions that make us feel and look good. And I think that is part of the key. We are conditioned in a society to either feel elated or feel depressed, basically. So we are either great or we feel worthless. And this is to do with the foundation of the House of Modernity, the idea that the sense of separability from each other and from the earth that creates the hierarchies of worth, right? And the economies that we have to engage in order to justify why we are alive. So especially for people in low intensity struggle, this need for validating a self-image of a virtuous person or being the protagonist of somebody or having something validated so that we don't feel worthless is generally takes a lot of space in a conversation. And so pedagogically, one of the things that is needed for us to hold space, to be able to hold space for difficult and painful things without feeling immobilized, without feeling overwhelmed or without wanting to be coddled or rescued from discomfort, is to create the sense that we can see ourselves in the full complexity and spectrum of humanity, the good, the bad, the ugly, the broken, and the fucked up in all of us, within and around, so that we don't turn away from the difficult things. We don't turn away when we see ourselves as not beautiful. We don't become fragile and infantilized in this process. So when we issue a call, I think for sobriety, maturity, discernment, and accountability, what we're talking about is our capacity for honesty, to just sit with, for example, the fact that many of these people would look at what we're doing even right now and roll their eyes and say, this is ridiculous. Like the computers, I can hear one of the elders saying, the computers you're using are blood minerals are coming from mining companies in places where other lives are being destroyed, so that you can be having this conversation today. But I can also hear her, it's it's a Mexican elder, saying it doesn't mean you shouldn't use this computer. It means that you have a responsibility, that you need to use it with we have a responsibility to interrupt this harm, rather than be just involved in self-care as we face this storm, right? But for us to be able to do that, we need to be doing some shadow work. We need to be okay with sitting with our shadows and with composting our shit, both the individual shit and the collective shit. And when I'm talking about shit and composting, so composting is turning things that are saturated and can be toxic into something that is generative, right? Creating new soil. But in this creation of new soil, it's a process of, there is a process of fermentation that needs to happen. And that is probably going to be painful and difficult and uncomfortable. And creating the stamina for that before we even start the process is part of what is needed if we come from a society that is constantly focusing our attention and our sense of well-being on pleasure, right? And it's self-infantilizing us all the time. We are rewarded for reproducing infantilizing behavior. So interrupting all of this is super hard. The invitation to see yourself as cute and pathetic is not that many people find very appealing. So there's the cell is very, very hard. And that's why we talk about this there's 4 ages, like honesty, humility, and that's a hard one too, especially for people who are feeling dethroned right now, and still feel like that they need the pedestal to be able to have any worth. So honesty, humility, hyper-self-reflexivity, which is taking account of where we got here and where our thoughts are coming from, what are the patterns that we're reproducing that are not leading necessarily to where we should be going. And the last thing is humor. We have also learned from the people that we work with in high intensity struggle that humor is a lifeline to be able to deal with this. But it's a very specific kind of humor that helps us hold heavy and difficult things with a light container. So not taking seriously what needs to be taken seriously, but not turning the seriousness into immobilization, right? And bringing back the pathetic nature of our existence, which is not a not a downer. It's actually an amazing thing. The fact that we are in more than one way insignificant. We're just a point in a continuum, takes a huge load from our back. And yes, we still carry the traumas and the accountabilities and the debts that our ancestors have incurred, especially the debt with the planet itself, right? And the responsibility for the future. But we are not the protagonists that modernity has conditioned us to believe we are.
Yes. Yeah. I often find myself saying to people, if you grew up in the kind of context that I grew up in, then you absorbed from one direction or another this idea that you're meant to create meaning on the scale of a single human lifetime, that you're meant to make some beautiful story out of this one life, however many years you get of it. And that this places an impossible weight on our shoulders, this kind of individualism. And that actually, letting that go, refusing the heroic story, to participate in something, in a story, the beginning and end of which, and the edges of which, the center of which will never be known to you, can be a huge relief, like going from taking yourself terribly, terribly seriously and being grumpy with everyone to being able to laugh at your own foolishness. And that somehow this stuff might actually weirdly be very close to the core of what's being asked for in the kind of question that we're gathered around tonight.
And another way of thinking about it, I think, is to move from our obsession with form, right? And the beauty of form to the beauty of movement. Because in many ways, whatever story we create in this life, number one, we are unreliable narrators of this experience. We will select and choose. Number two, it's going to be beautiful and fucked up. Right? There's no way to, but we want it to be, we feel entitled to present it in our selected way and for it to be validated as we want it to be validated. And the problem, I think, once we start having meetings about this and meetings about the end of the world like this one, that desire for the beauty of our story to be recognized takes a lot of the space of the conversation that should be about something else that could actually do something, move things in a very different way. So part of this has been one of the challenges I think that I found in participating in many meetings, both like the meetings I participate at the interface of questions of unsustainability, so climate catastrophe or climate justice, and issues related to historical, systemic, and ongoing violence. And it's interesting because there's generally two types of spaces I think that I can see happening. One is a space where there's a lot of critique and sometimes a competition for who can ask the most critical questions, who can call out more. And you can understand why that happens, because there is a belief that when something is being described and called out, the harmful patterns are going to be interrupted. And it generally then becomes also a way of reclaiming a moral high ground, right? Where you feel validated in your truth. And this is because many truths have been repressed and invisibilized, and you can understand why that is appealing. On the other hand, there are other groups that don't want to reproduce the toxicity that often happens in the critical spaces, and then you focus on creating community and care and all of that, but the excess of that is where you just go along to get along, and then it becomes an enmeshment situation where there's a lot of projective empathy, where people are expected to behave in certain ways to keep the peace, right? And there is this sometimes this idea of oneness and of beauty, and then whoever brings the critical question is perceived to be bringing divisiveness, right? So you see that a lot, for example, here in Vancouver, in the psychedelic community, in the New Age movement, where there's this notion of oneness that then becomes spiritual bypassing, right, of the difficult questions. On the other hand, then you have in the critical communities a rejection of spirituality, for example, because it's associated with this spiritual bypassing, and then a preference for anger. And unprocessed anger that then becomes extremely toxic for the community as well. And this happens at a neurobiological level. So what I think would be needed is a space where we can be critical and loving at the same time, but not coddled, right? That's the most important thing, that we agree that coddling is not helping anybody. That we have to figure out a way of inhabiting a call for a movement of sobriety, maturity, discernment, and accountability, that where nobody is left off the hook, but where we recognize that vulnerabilities are unevenly distributed, even within low intensity struggle spaces, right? And where we can actually move beyond the form of politics that we have been conditioned within modernity to manifest. In modernity's form of politics is based, we love this acronyms and letters that help us remember things. So it's 5 E's. So the politics of modernity is based on exceptionalism. So exceptionalism is, number one, human exceptionalism. Humans are the protagonists, and then within the human group, there is this group that will have the answer, or that group, and there's going to be a competition for who's the most special group that will have the answer. And this follows your heroic, what do you call it, the Jungian prototype, archetype that is coming to mind, the heroic archetype. So the first E is exceptionalism. The second one is entitlement. The politics of modernity is based on an expansion of entitlements, generally expansion of colonial entitlements. Number 3 is exaltedness, this need to validate and to congratulate those who are in that position of leadership or of heroic leadership, right? The feeling that like, this is amazing, this is great, it's about greatness. So exaltedness, then we have the empowerment of the ego. So we believe that it's through the empowerment of the ego that we will achieve the agency that is needed for change. And the last one is the externalization of blame. So in any idea of emancipation, for example, we have to externalize blame, to say like the corporations or the bad people are the problem. And we are the virtuous, heroic people who are going to actually solve this, right? We're conditioned to do this. Actually, if we don't do this, we become unintelligible. Nobody understands what we're trying to do within modernity, right? But what could be possible through the call for sobriety, maturity, discernment, and accountability is this movement of decentering ourselves in creating a container where we center the land, the earth, the planet that is sick. And because it's sick, we're also sick because we're part of it. In the sickness itself, and learning from the disease in order to be able to figure out how we can heal, and not just heal in an abstract way, but heal our thinking, our ways of thinking, heal our ways of feeling, heal our ways of relating, heal our ways of exchanging and redistributing sustenance in this metabolism, heal our sense of belonging, and also like belonging to the bigger story of life and the bigger metabolism in terms of how we approach both life and death, but especially death. How to live and die well is part of what needs to change in the story, because modernity has been a project of trying to avoid or eliminate death. So I think that also relates to what you've been doing.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, one of the trails that I've been following over the last few years has to do with a sense that the culture that is responsible for bringing the world to the pass that we're at is, for reasons that are deeply entangled with how we got here, also peculiarly ill-equipped to handle the knowledge of a thing like climate change. Because as you say, one of the distinctive features of Western modernity is this evasion of death. And we can tell the heroic story about why that is possible through the achievements of modern medicine and public health and so on. And it's not that there's no truth in that story, but it's that there's a lot left out of it. But, one way and another, we get further into our lives before we have a full-on encounter with mortality than any people who've ever lived. And this is part of what you were saying before about the infantilization. We are able to live as children. It's not an accident that when people look at the patterns and features that repeat in many times and places in the initiations that young people go through, that a vivid staged encounter with the reality of your own death is very often part of that experience, along with an actual risk of death during the experience. And, I've heard it said by various people from different cultures and contexts, children are born, but grown-ups are made. Mm-hmm. And making grown-ups is the work of culture. And it seems to me that part of what that entails is coming into awareness of and responsibility for consequences. Being aware of the consequences, the cost of your life. And as Robin Wall Kimmerer says in Braiding Sweetgrass, living in such a way as to be worth the cost of your life on the world that you take from. That has been not out of some kind of romanticized moral purity, but just as a baseline ecological fact. No human culture lasts very long which doesn't attend to that. We've been able to defer that knowledge through a combination of oil and coal on the one hand, and black bodies and indigenous bodies on the other hand, for a few hundred years. And so to produce a way of living which we've convinced ourselves can be extended to everybody else, although there is no proof of this, but that makes us feel better to tell that story. A way of living in which it is possible and probably even necessary to be oblivious to the cost of your own life, to be oblivious of the consequences of the things that make up your day-to-day, in a way that until recently was the privilege of mad emperors. Until quite recently, in the whole of human history, almost the only people who could live the way that is normal in low-intensity contexts today were the kind of emperors who made their horses into senators. That's the level of detachment from consequence. And I say it's not just possible, but almost necessary for participation, because part of what happens as we wake up to the cost of our living and the consequences of it is it can so easily be paralyzing. I see that so much amongst young people today, who are very often the ones who are really facing and absorbing what we know and what we have grounds to fear about the climate crisis. And I see, old people, I see men of you know, my father's generation here in Sweden or back home where I grew up in England, who have been dedicated to an idea of themselves as rational, you know, people who are trained as engineers or scientists, and now in their 70s have inhabited all their lives this story of the role of their generation and of people like them within world history. And it's like just dawning on them, a bit like the end of The Remains of the Day, when the butler begins to realize that the guy who he's put on a pedestal might actually have been a Nazi. Like, it's just beginning to dawn on them that maybe this story is vastly at odds with the way it's all actually playing out. And there's almost a kind of, there's a pathos in watching them contort these trained rational engineers' minds to the arguments of climate denialism, because the cost of really facing what we know and what we have grounds to fear is having the story they've lived by torn away from them. And I can become sympathetic for that for a while until I see that that is where the weight that is pressing on the shoulders of the 18-year-olds is coming from. It's that the people in the generations ahead of them are not carrying the weight of knowing. And so much of it is falling on the young people today in countries like this. So we should open this up in a moment to questions. But Vanessa, just before we do that, this is always the hardest one to answer in question times, but I want to put it, which is like, okay, so what do we do? What first steps, what small appropriate steps, starting from where we find ourselves rather than where we might like to be? Have you got anything that's coming to you just in this moment that you'd like to share with us?
I was thinking about the AA for humanity that we have been talking about, the need for recognizing that the culture we have been conditioned to find pleasure in and to find a specific form of well-being is sick, and the level of difficulty of interrupting these patterns, which are patterns that can be compared to substance abuse. It is as difficult as interrupting heroin addiction. And then what is necessary apart from a possible rock bottom, right? And this might be different for different people. But I think the kind of things that we're doing with our collective in terms of the spaces that we need for that to even have a whiff of a chance of being something that people consider is this idea of walking a tightrope between naive, desperate hope for an answer, a hero, or a group of people to have the answers, or a nostalgia for a time, or a practice, or something that we can hold on to, and in the fear of hopelessness and absolute relativism and hedonism and misanthropy and banalization of cruelty, right? So there's naive hope, naive desperate hope, and there is desolate hopelessness that we're afraid of. And there's a tightrope in between that we can't fall into either of those, where we walk with honesty, humility, hyper-self-reflexivity, and humor, guided by a compass of sobriety, maturity, discernment, and accountability in its deeper meanings, and in meanings that can interrupt the patterns we have been conditioned to understand. But I'll put it back to you. What do you think? Because we've been talking about this AA for humanity for some time, and we haven't really had the chance to have this conversation in the last 3 months. I'm really curious to see where you're taking it.
Something I'm feeling at the moment is, it does feel like quite a few of us have learned quite a bit over the last year or so because of the pandemic about the possibilities of depth in spaces like this. The sort of strange miracle of the times when we do slip past the limits of screens and cameras and experience a togetherness that is not delusional.
Mm-hmm.
And that meeting in relatively small groups repeatedly over periods of time, you know, my friends who are in AA or other 12-step recovery programs, many of them will go to a meeting every day.
Okay.
And they say, you know, your illness doesn't take a day off, so you can't either. And that reminds me of what culture really means and looks like. You know, actually, when I talk to old guys who go out onto the land and keep traditions that were supposedly destroyed and eliminated or rendered obsolete by modernity in different parts of the world, they say similar things about you don't get a day off from this work. I think in a weird way, Alcoholics Anonymous is one of the most convincing examples of people out of the depths in the heart of modern Western, urban, mainly white context, improvising something that does the work of culture in a way that our societies as a whole, because of their dependencies on fossil fuels on the one hand and colonialism on the other hand, have been able to defer doing the work of culture. Partly just because you don't arrive at an AA meeting without having burnt your life to the ground, one way or another. The cost of entry is high. And in that sense, it resembles what initiation has been like in other times and places. You know, it's not an advert for alcoholism, it's just a sign of how fucked up things are. But I've seen, I think, particularly around the new climate movements that emerged around 2018, the school strikes that started here, the Extinction Rebellion in the UK and spreading elsewhere. I've seen something that's reaching towards these same qualities in a way that wasn't true of the climate activism of the era when Paul and I wrote the Dark Mountain Manifesto. There've been some new things going on, a move into depth, building on the work of people like Alistair McIntosh as well, who've been calling us to depth for a long time. But I think that that's, and I think that, yeah, just practices of gathering. I was thinking when you were speaking earlier, Vanessa, of something that the theatre maker Chris Good says. He says, I don't think the problem is that we don't know, or at least that we don't know enough. The problem seems to be that we don't have living spaces in which to know what we know, in which to feel that knowledge, without that then sending us into panic, despair, shutdown, denial, or the rest of the responses we're familiar with. And one of the reasons I've worked a lot with artists over the years is because I think that certain kinds of artistic practice carry a lot of knowledge about how to hold those spaces in which we can sit with really difficult shit without going into those instant reactions. And also, more simply, art can give us enough beauty to sit with the darkness for long enough that we take the risk of being changed. And you know, the wording of this session is about transformation. The cost of knowing is being changed by what we know, losing who we thought we were. There's always loss involved in transformation. And you know, powerful, deep transformation doesn't make you any promises of what's going to lie on the other side of it. Like, as long as we think there has to be a promise, we're not going to pass through the kinds of transformation that are called for.
Yeah, we have the same experience with artists too in our collective. And one of the offerings, I think, for the end of the session could be looking at the work that was done in collaboration with Dani D'Emilia on radical tenderness, so that we can wrap up with an example of that. We could do it now or we could do it later. But I think it's time to open up on that note.
A question or something that wants to be spoken.
I was just trying to read Ben's card that he was putting up, and I couldn't read it, Ben. So hold it up again.
Notice how you move between your comfort, stretch, and panic zones. From co-sensing with radical tenderness, there's a card deck now. Beautiful. Thank you for creating that, Vanessa and Collective.
Thank you, Ben. That's very interesting to see it appear in another side of the world.
Wonderful.
And how perfect that I randomly picked that card
That one.
just
Yeah,
after you said what you said, Dougald. I do have a question. Having spent some time in 12-step rooms, there are promises in the 12-step program that are quite beautiful. So it's interesting to hear you say, with real transformation, there can't be a promise. And there's so much about uncertainty, so much wisdom about uncertainty, Vanessa, that your work calls forth. So is there something? I mean, I hear a lot of sort of this and that kind of thinking. Can there be a set of promises that are not promises in the old paradigm way, perhaps? Like this hope and hopelessness that we both have to hold together somehow.
I feel like I want to take that question away and talk on it with the people from 12 Step who I've been working with around this stuff, because it's a really good one to think about. And I don't know if I've got that much to say to it immediately.
me too. It's a great question. We actually have let's say timetable conversations about the interface between AA and what we're trying to do with radical tenderness, what Dougald is trying to do with home, with people from AA, with a lot of experience in AA. And if you want to be part of that conversation, please join. I think it's very important. But I don't have any answers right now. I would have to. This is part of the whole process. Thank you.
The one thought I have is that it may well be that AA, through its experience, is able to make certain kinds of promises to certain kinds of people in a way that holds. And maybe that's part of what we're working towards and have not yet arrived at with the kind of processes that we're working on. So I'll take that away and think about it. So, Mark, your hand was up.
Yeah. Thank you both so much. The question I have is around, even if we weren't breaking our planetary boundaries, the level of femicide, ecocide, eternal war, these questions for me cannot be detached from the colonial, and where I see hope is that actually any answer to the question of living within our planetary boundaries is that these questions must be answered as part of that process. So when I see the kind of fascination with technical fixes, all this abstraction, it's massively frustrating. But to come back to the idea that we can, these central abominations that are continually rolled out by the human species is exciting, because that those are core, I think, to changing the paradigm which we find ourselves in. So I'm interested in your perspectives on that. Thank you.
Thank you for bringing colonialism to the table. Generally, it's underlying everything that I'm talking about. But the same way that Dougald said that we are in a culture that cannot deal or hold space for the climate catastrophe, colonialism is the other side of it too, right? So how we got there. But we can understand colonialism in different ways. Generally, people think about the occupation of lands and the subjugation of people. and Palestine comes to mind right now as well. So there is another way of thinking about it, which is the way that this community, I work with a network of indigenous communities in Brazil called Teia das Cinco Curas, and their understanding of colonialism is one step deeper, I think, in this, that they say colonialism is something that is about our relationship with each other. Colonialism is the sense of separability from us and the land and us with everything else. It's the sense of in the layer we are individuals, but we are individuals within a metabolism, right? So it's the non-metabolic way of relating to the world, that at this point our relation to the world is a relationship of consumption, not only of stuff, but of relationships, of knowledges, of experiences. And one of the things they say too is that colonialism is delicious, and it affects our unconscious too. So it's very difficult to interrupt the pleasures of it, right? So if it was not delicious, it would have been ended a long time ago. But because it is delicious and it makes us feel good, and it gives us the fake and plastic version of happiness and joy, that's why we keep it. So in order to be able to interrupt that and go back to a neurobiology where we sense both our sense of entanglement with everything, not just what's beautiful, but what's not beautiful as well, what's fucked up as well, and sense a visceral form of responsibility that is not an intellectual choice or a matter of convenience. It would take a huge it takes neurogenesis, basically. Like the level we're talking about in terms of a changing paradigm, it's a change in our neurobiology, because our neurobiology has been affected by the ways we've been conditioned within modernity, or by the house of modernity, by living in this house. So the level of the challenge, the magnitude of the challenge is huge. I don't think it's impossible. I have a hunch that the window of time for us to do that is actually closing. It may be that we'll have to change this project, not as a project of helping humanity survive, but a project of helping us die well in this system. I don't know if we have the time, but I do believe that in this process of dying, of death, if we change our relationship to pain and to death, a lot of things that are not imaginable right now are going to become possible. So it's like this idea of what's viable but unimaginable right now if we engage in a different kind of process. So that would be my response, but it's a great question. Thank you.
It's around trauma, and in particular the unconscious. It feels to me that the unconscious, the way that our trauma lives within us without us knowing, is really, really crucial to the predicament that we're in. You know, we can hide things from ourselves at a range of depths. So there's some things that we know but we don't acknowledge, and there's some things that we just don't know, and it needs like a process to get it out, and sometimes just a lot of luck as well, or blessing, or whatever it is, you know. And I'm aware that, you know, certainly in my culture, we have almost no socialized ways of working with the unconscious. You know, we can maybe work in our close relationships or with a therapist, one-to-one, maybe in a group, but there's nothing in our culture that enables us to do that work of healing, those deep that deep damage that has been done to us by growing up as, you know, within a system of domination with whatever privilege or lack of privilege we've ended up with. And yeah, it was just a really, really big question for me, is how the hell do we, you know, given the amount of trauma, given the amount of damage, given the amount of internalization, and the fact that we are almost completely unused to working with that? What tools are there? And I remember hearing you, Vanessa, I think it was in the Coming Down to Earth conference, just mention that the people who you work with have quite a different conception of the unconscious. And I was super interested to hear a bit more about that. But you take your pick. Thank you.
Dougald, do you want to start? And then
Okay then. I was thinking about an article you sent me last week, Vanessa, which was a review from the Boston Review of a number of anti-racist nonfiction books, some of which will be very well known among a group like this, including White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And it was a very nuanced, thoughtful, careful review. And there was a part towards the end of it that I found incredibly helpful, because it emphasized that, you know, part of the resistance from both right and left that there has been to the stuff that is often being filed under, you know, woke or identity politics or social justice movements and so on, the pushback against that is down to a deep question about whether things like work on trauma and relational work are political and might even be the central political work. And I realized that part of what had helped me with this was that, you know, 20 years ago, I discovered Alistair McIntosh's work, and it led me into so much of what I've been doing. And he would always talk about cultural psychotherapy, that you could have psychotherapy where the subject was a culture rather than an individual. It wasn't about the dysfunctionality of an individual struggling to fit into the culture around them. It was about the possibility that the whole culture needed to go through these kinds of processes. And the thing that unlocked for me after reading that article was I'd been struggling with why some people who I know and love are really stuck in, you know, a kind of alienation from what's been going on with the political and social movements that have emerged over the last few years, things like Black Lives Matter, and like the gulf between their perception of what they're talking about when they talk about those movements and my perception of it has been so big that I couldn't even make sense of it. And I couldn't attribute it all to the fact that they were reading, you know, bad faith, anti-woke stuff that they would send me, although that might have something to do with it. But then what I grasped was, like, if the stuff that matters most about this is relational, if it's about embodiment, somatic work, healing justice, like all of these bodies of practice around trauma and that are coming out, predominantly coming from Black, queer, feminist, American thinkers and activists. And if lots of people are only encountering the movements or hashtags that relate to this in spaces like Twitter, like Twitter is not a space in which the relational can operate. Like, it's too low context and too high speed. Like, it's literally not a space where the relational can be any more than a motorway is a space where children can play. And this has actually been really helpful for me in unlocking like why I've had this uncrossable gulf with friends, because literally if the only spaces they've been encountering this stuff in are spaces like Twitter, they're never going to have touched the things at the heart of it that are what has made it matter so much for me. So I suppose what I'm saying there is there are a lot of people who've been doing a lot of work because they've had to do a lot of work because of the places they're starting from around trauma. Like, part of the importance of decolonial thinking for me was just realizing that there were people who were decades ahead of people like me and Paul. You know, when we were writing The End of the World as We Know It is Not the End of the World, full stop, in 2009 in the Dark Mountain Manifesto, we were struggling to articulate something. We're talking about uncivilization. It took me years to realize that uncivilization might, amongst other things, be a clumsy attempt starting from the kind of place I was starting from at the same kind of work that goes in the name of decoloniality, like the work of disentangling ourselves from the big stories and power games that go on under the grand narrative of civilization and seeing how much was missing from that, how much shit had been swept under the carpet of that needed composting. So just to say that, Like a lot of the tools, a lot of the resources, a lot of the practices we need are there, but they've been developed by people whose voices don't get put in the foreground as easily as somebody like me gets their voice put in the foreground. And so, yeah, that's.
Yeah, I think there is a lot in it, but there's also this suspicion that I have, everything that is written in English will still be intelligible within the same parameters that we're used to. And maybe the critique is really good, but the proposition is just for just a different version of the same form of existence, right? That's why one of the things we've done was to look for how other like especially the ones that we had access to, right? The communities would process trauma. So I think the short way to talk about it is that we all want to move on together, but we don't want to compost the shit in the low intensity struggle thing, and we don't know how to, and we're drowning in it because of that, right? And the only ways we have, as you said, Eva, is talk and meaning and centering the human body, whereas these communities would have a different form of psychoanalysis where it's the land that is conscious and it's the land that helps, it's the plants that will help us do it. It's practices of discipline and sensorial deprivation, actually not talking and feeling pain voluntarily, or not eating or drinking for 4 days, that will get us into a space where we can see the structure of the ego from a very different perspective, and rely on other forces, metabolic forces, to survive and to clear that clutter, right? So I'm talking about communities here in Canada that practice the sun dance, where there is this long-term fasting and also flesh offerings, where you are facing pain on a voluntary basis so that you are not haunted by it. You know the level of the cost of your life and the level of debt that you have. I'm talking about communities in Latin America that use mescaline, that use ayahuasca, jurema, that San Pedro, for entheogenic experiences where these plants allow you to go into the unconscious, but with the teachings that they have to navigate and cleanse in a different way. The problem that we have now in Western society is that there's a predation and a consumption of these techniques, right, without the teachings. So our project with them has been about trying to understand the teachings better and translate them into educational approaches in the West with or without having to ingest any entheogenics, right? To see what is the direction of these teachings. And what we found is that it is a very deeper notion of sobriety, maturity, discernment, and accountability that you receive training for a long time before you have the encounters with the plant. And the encounter with the plant is the encounter with a being that will help you do 100 therapy sessions, talk therapy sessions in one night, right? With the support of the whole community. So whether it is, I don't think this is scalable, but I do believe that the lessons that we can take from this could help and support an AA for humanity with or without the assistance of the plants. I think this as a super like long-term future, that's maybe where we are trying to get to.
Tada, I'd like to bring you in.
Hi, hello. I haven't spoken into a circle of this many people in a while. But something I've said about, I think that there's a few things that stuck out for me, particularly one of them is around initiation rites. And I'm not saying that as an initiated person, but I'm saying that as a person who's kind of trying to move in that direction. And one of the things we keep, I think, fucking up royally is we try to create culture before we become adults. So you have all these people talking about consent culture, nurturance culture, anti-racist culture, blah, 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 decolonial culture, but they're not an adult yet. So what happens when you have people who don't know the reality of how the world works, and they're allowed to make culture? It's a joke, actually. If you really look at it, I think the premise. And so that's something that brings me a lot of anger when I look around, because I think it's really poor excuses for activism and change and all these dialogues. It's just nonsense. You really need to commit to become an adult first. And we don't even have an understanding of what that is. So this is like probably the part of the struggle, and this is probably part of why we go to the indigenous peoples around the world and say, how do we become an adult? Which also sometimes they don't know either, I would say, because in some ways, if you look at our history, our indigeneity also led us here. So let's not try to make it like we can warp back to the past somehow, because we're going to come back here in the first place. That's dissociation into the past, which is what a lot of people, I think, do when they do a lot of this kind of land healing, ancestral healing, is they try to dissociate into some kind of past. And then they dissociate. Some people dissociate into the future, right? They become really futurist and utopian, and some people go the other way. And also feeling bad can be dissociative. So being really apocalyptic and everything's horrible can be dissociative. And going back to the past and like, oh, my white ancestors are so horrible, that's also dissociative. So we're living with all that. And so something that I've been interested in then is, what are the actual baseline skills and understandings we need to participate in a community as an adult that we don't get? And I would say the entheogenic experience is probably a pretty leading good one, but also very risky, because the information that plant medicines and other experiences, even just fasting, will show you are the kind of things that let you rule the world. Right? So something we have to understand is that the world is run over by people that have an understanding of how reality works. All the people who rule the world, like Putin, like Trump, whatever, Bill Gates, whatever, they're all occultists, right? They're all like medicine people in their own fucked up way. They see the code of reality and how to manipulate people. So the thing that's important then, as I understand, to become an adult, you get exposed to that information, but then you also have the responsibility of how to use it, right? So this is kind of thing that we're vibrating on and trying to understand, I think. And I think the number one, personally, I think maybe one of the most important things we need to get very real with is that the older indigenous animist traditions, we tend to look at them as a way to experience salvation from them. And like have this like, I want to connect to a tree, I want to connect to nature, I want to feel connected. I think that's a little bit probably closed-minded, because in my understanding, I think you get exposed to a lot more brutality about what life actually is. And this is the key component I think also Westerners miss about the kind of initiatory process. And this is why people don't heal. They're trying to get a good experience. It's like, experiencing meeting your ancestors to realize they cannibalized each other, they raped each other, they beat each other, they killed each other. And that's almost animally inputted. Because if you look at animals, that's what they do too. So we have to start like realize our ancestors are not just human. They're like bacteria, they're like viruses, they do lots of shit. So as humans, there's this like realization, I think, that comes with something that's very stark around there. How to hold all those impulses in our body, which are all our ancestral impulses, and actually be able to transmute them. Right? So you have all these impulses in ourselves, and how do we transmute that? Because humans need to live in a collective, but we also want to do a lot of harm to each other. This is like the impulse that lives within us. So how to negotiate that is a lot of what culture is about. So what, like, for example, you have a dance. Dances are all about that. You become an insect. You become a, you know? Do animals rape each other? Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you can go on, like, ducks apparently rape each other. Like animal mating is like extremely non-consensual a lot of the time, where you like,
Unfortunately, dolphins as well.
Yeah. So there you go. But I guess I'm coming down to the thing I wanted to share though is I think because Doug Dougald was talking about the left and the right. And the thing that I think we're really missing as a piece of awareness is that the indigenous animist frameworks understand that information is alive. So when we think about ideologies and ideas to run our society and thoughts to run our society, those are not us, right? That's information running us. And that information has an agenda outside of ourselves. And that's what actually the animist people call gods and spirits, is information that has an agenda outside of us. So to form a good relationship with them is something that's incredibly important. And I think one of the troubles that we're getting into is that a lot of these conversations around change become honed around political ideology and ideas, but the ideas, like the hashtags themselves, they're literally viruses that want to spread. So you're actually using a platform that you think is to your benefit, but the platform is actually using you back. And we need to become really collectively smarter, because we're all on the internet right now. And imagine that the internet itself has an agenda to propagate itself. And this is what we're living in. So the internet is also an information. We're actually still in the wilderness. And I think that's a really important realization for modern people, is that we're in the wilderness right now. When you think about how our lives are run by information, those are all beings. Those are literally like we're in a forest of information that wants to kill us, that we can eat for nourishment. Like, we're still there. And I think that awareness is actually really, really important. And a lot of why a lot of these activist movements that are couched on information spreading and not thinking about what it is, and inevitably end up failing and returning to the cycle, because the information often going through the most simple and most intense ways of propagation, especially through things like hashtags and online dissemination, that's the nuts of imperialism in and of itself, is information wanting to spread universally fast and intense. So that's a really important piece. So what we have lost is this idea, understanding that information is alive, which is why communities used to be helmed by people who can manipulate information and understand what it's doing. That's what the roles of like witch doctors and stuff were. So we still have that. We still have entire political systems run by people who know how to manipulate information at the most fast and intense levels. So that's going to put the point there.
Thank you, Tada. That was a pretty heavy download of information. There's a lot there to process.
Thank you, Tada. And
chewing
I
on.
think partly what you're pointing to is this this trend of romanticization and idealization of everything, of nature, of humanity, of ourselves, right? In this. And then on the other hand, it's either romanticization or vilification, pathologization, deficit theorization. And we have to get out of this and be able to sit with the realness of it all without wanting to, the coddling of the bubble, right? And see nature for its realness and in its both its beauty and brutality as well, within us and around us, the beautiful, the ugly, the broken, and the fucked up. And we're not in assuming we are already there is a mistake. The most responsible thing is to assume we're not there yet, right? And continue to ask the questions and find the practices that might help us. I have put on the chat this in relation to what you talked about in terms of entheogens, something about that came from the communities in Brazil, especially from the Amazonian communities that use ayahuasca. It's a call for accountability in the use of sacred plants that I think is important. And I'm also putting here Chief Ninawa's, it's a recording for a conference on education that also resonates a lot with what you were saying in terms of not romanticizing Indigenous people or idealizing Indigenous people as well, right? And if there was a question on the chat about how we are talking about the we, I think the we that we have chosen to use today is the we of humanity and our relationship to the planet, recognizing that the vulnerabilities and the violences within humanity are also unevenly distributed. Somebody? I'm not sure if this is an intervention or not. So yeah, I think there's one more hand up. It's Justin, and I think it would be the last question, Justin, probably, right?
Yeah, I don't know what the question is, but your talks were wonderful, really good, but they weren't amazing. You know, they're not, they're real. By saying they're not amazing is to say this, I really loved that, just like getting real about this. And I felt like your initiation point was really powerful. I just wonder whether that's about admitting our failures. So like really being able to get on with trying to confront the machine that we have become and that's around us, but doing it with real gratitude for our failures and learning from our failures. And I love what Debbie Rose says. Debbie Bird Rose, she talks about giving up hope. She just says, give up hope and attend to relations. Just attend to making good now, really taking care now. But there's something in your initiation thing which I haven't got, and that's why I'm voicing it. Just something about really being able to fail and fail well, and really just, so we get it wrong and we get it all wrong and we get it all wrong and we get it all wrong. And the more we can allow that, the more we can really be present with each other. And who knows what will happen? We don't have to have the future to solve or to say is dystopian. Just we need to attend to those relations. That I just love that. And I wonder whether that ties with what you're saying about initiation.
Yeah, I was thinking at a point as I was listening to what you were saying before, Tada, about Martin Shaw when he joined us for the climate sessions that we ran in the autumn. And I asked him about initiation. I asked him whether he could imagine like initiation being available on the scale that was called for. And he said, look, let's tone it down, because it's easy for us to project a lot onto a big word like initiation, just in the same way as we can project a lot onto other people's cultures in ways that aren't helpful to anyone. He said, but maybe we just can talk about maturity. And I think maybe a lot of maturity has to do with letting your failures in, including them within the story of yourself, within your knowing of yourself, rather than outsourcing them or sweeping them under the carpet.
A follow-up if nobody else is speaking. I'm just interested in the chat that goes on and then the speaking here, and how much chat is helpful and really allows us to be present, and how much it doesn't. Because when you said, Dougald, you wanted to not have the chat when you're having your talk, between the two of you, when I heard that beforehand, I felt, ooh, that's a bit controlling. Yeah, so that was just my response. And then my experience was, great, there's just a space to listen to two people. And then I love the chat too. So I'm just with the kind of, so that's, I had to voice that because that's the underbelly of where I am right now with this screen and these words, and just that, the confusion of it, and being willing to kind of welcome that and voice it rather than be quiet and pretend that this is the reality and that's not something more important.
Me too. I'm divided. I'm divided. And I think there's one thing in the chat that is interesting, but there was a response also for you, Justin, about the gifts of failure. In our collective, we have an internal peer review process where failure is good data. So failure is where we can actually not have to start from scratch. And that's very important to receive that as a gift. I put the peer review process, the internal one that we have on the chat, but there's somebody there asking, and I think it's important to maybe finish with that, about the land and how to do all this work living in a city. One of the things that it took me a while to understand too is that my body is the land as well. We're part of the metabolism. Everything is actually land. And it's land modified, and it's land, but it is still land, and it's part of the dis-ease that we find ourselves in urban centers that are trying to set themselves against what it's considered, or try to selectively engage with nature, with what we understand as nature, because nature is everything, right? So I think the radical tenderness exercise that comes in the cards would be a very useful thing for us actually to finish this, but we don't have the time. But it's an invitation to co-sense with radical tenderness, which is this idea of being critical and loving at the same time, and realizing this the whole spectrum of things that we are, both known, unknown, and unknowable. So I will have to go to, I have a PhD defense that I'm an examiner for in about 5 minutes. So I have to go. I would like to thank you all for sitting with us. I would love to hear, I'm waiting for the video because I made lots of notes as well. I'm learning as I'm going, right? But thank you so much for inviting me. I'll leave you with the Radical Tenderness invitation, and I wish you all the best. I wish I had the time to be present to the whole conference, but I'm looking forward to the videos. Thank you for opening the space. Thank you for making the time for being together, and I hope to see all of you at some other point soon. Thank you. Thank you.
I just want to echo what you said, Vanessa, and say thanks so much to everybody, to all of the questions and sharing and knowledge that's been shared in this session from you all and in the chat and beyond. There's a lot to go away and think about. I'm very glad to have been able to be a small part of what you're doing this week.
Thank you so much, Dougald. And thank you so much, everybody, for coming and participating and listening and questions and chatting and not chatting and all those different things. So if you want to open your mics and say goodbye, maybe in your own language.
Bye. Thank you.
Hey, this was wonderful.
Bye, everyone. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you, everyone.
Deepest
Good
gratitude.
to meet you. Bye.
Aloha.
बहुत मजा
Bye,
आया
all.